In the glittering ballroom of Larchmont Hall, a priceless diamond pendant, the Star of Avalon, vanishes during a charity auction, sparking whispers of theft among a cast of suspects. A flamboyant auctioneer, a brash bidder, a nervous jeweller, and a charming widow. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, can unravel the web of ambition, debt, and deception. A tiny scratch, a waxy speck, and a monogrammed handkerchief led her to a cunning plot, where one desperate soul swapped the jewel for a fake, hiding the truth in plain sight. Will she catch the thief before the trail goes cold? Chapter 1. The Auction at Larchmont Hall. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Larchmont Hall, where the annual charity auction was about to commence. The Elizabethan manor, its ivy-clad walls glowing in the golden light, stood as a testament to the Worthington family's enduring prominence in the county. Inside, the ballroom was a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers glittered above a sea of polished oak, and the air hummed with the murmur of well-dressed guests, their voices mingling with the clink of champagne flutes. At the heart of the evening's anticipation was Lot 17, the Star of Avalon, a diamond pendant of breathtaking clarity, its single stone suspended in a delicate platinum setting, refracting light like a prism of captured moonlight. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the third row, was an unassuming figure amidst the grandeur. Her black lace shawl draped over a modest grey dress, she worked her knitting needles with a rhythm as steady as a metronome, her fingers deft despite their age. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, invited perhaps out of courtesy by the hostess, Lady Beatrice Worthington. But her mild blue eyes, framed by wire-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing. They flitted from face to face, noting the subtle tensions beneath the polished smiles. At the front of the room, Mr. Percival Hurst, the auctioneer, commanded attention. A wiry man with a penchant for theatricality, his moustache was waxed to precise points, and his voice carried the cadence of a stage actor. He stood at a mahogany podium, gavel in hand, extolling the virtues of a silver candelabrum before moving to the evening's centrepiece. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone rising, "the Star of Avalon, a jewel of unparalleled beauty, authenticated by our esteemed jeweller, Mr. Ezra Golding." The crowd leaned forward as the pendant was unveiled, its diamond catching the chandelier's light in a dazzling display. "Among the bidders, Mr. Roland Finch stood out, not for elegance, but for sheer presence. A young industrialist whose fortune had been forged in steelworks. His broad shoulders strained against a tailored suit that seemed at odds with his blunt manner. His bids were loud, almost aggressive, as if the pendant were a prize to be wrested rather than won. Miss Marple noted his flushed cheeks and the way his hand clenched when another bidder raised the stakes. Beside Finch, Mr. Ezra Golding, the jeweller, sat with a quieter intensity. His thin frame was hunched slightly, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he scribbled notes in a small ledger. He had certified the pendant's authenticity earlier that day, a task that had drawn murmurs of respect from the guests. Yet his fingers, Miss Marple observed, twitched nervously, and his gaze darted to the display case more often than seemed necessary. Across the aisle, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a widow of striking elegance, watched the proceedings with a serene smile. Her silver hair was swept into an impeccable chignon, and her emerald gown set off her still youthful complexion. She held a fan, its ivory slats fluttering occasionally, though the room was cool. Miss Marple recalled village whispers about Mrs. Henshaw's late husband, a man of charm but dwindling means, and wondered at the widow's presence among such wealth. As the bidding for the Star of Avalon reached a fever pitch, Hurst's gavel hovered. £10,000, Finch bellowed, his voice drowning out a rival bid. A murmur of awe rippled through the crowd. 11, came a counter from a gentleman in the back. Finch's jaw tightened, but he raised again. 12,000! The room held its breath. Hurst, with a flourish, called, "Going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Roland Finch." The gavel struck, and applause erupted. Miss Marple's needles paused. She had noticed something in that final moment. A flicker of unease on Golding's face, a quick glance between Hurst and Mrs. Henshaw, and Finch's triumphant grin, which seemed more forced than jubilant. The pendant remained in its case, to be collected after the auction's close. As the guests rose, mingling and marvelling, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already threading together the evening's subtle discordances. A jewel like that, she thought, draws more than admiration. It draws envy, and perhaps something darker. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Jewel. The grand ballroom of Larchmont Hall, so recently alive with the fervour of bidding, now buzzed with a different energy, one of shock and disquiet. The chandeliers still cast their golden glow, but the mood had shifted as sharply as a wind turning before a storm. The auction had concluded, the guests were sipping their final glasses of champagne, and Lady Beatrice Worthington, the evening's gracious hostess, had stepped forward to inspect the display case housing the Star of Avalon, the diamond pendant that had fetched a staggering £12,000. Her gloved hand reached for the velvet cushion within the glass case, and then she froze. A gasp escaped her lips, sharp enough to cut through the hum of conversation. The cushion was bare. The pendant was gone. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the back of the room, paused her knitting, her needles suspended mid-stitch. Her mild blue eyes, framed by spectacles, scanned the crowd as murmurs of alarm spread like ripples on a pond. She had been watching the room all evening, noting the interplay of glances, the subtle shifts in posture, the way certain hands lingered near certain objects. Now, as the guests turned to one another, their faces a mixture of disbelief and curiosity, she felt the familiar stir of a puzzle taking shape. A theft, she murmured to herself, and in such a crowded room. How very bold Lady Beatrice, her face pale beneath her powdered cheeks, raised a trembling hand to silence the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her station despite its quiver, "there has been a grave misfortune. The Star of Avalon has vanished from its case." The room erupted in gasps and exclamations. A few gentlemen moved toward the display case, as if proximity might reveal the jewel's hiding place, while others exchanged sceptical glances, suspecting a theatrical ruse. Miss Marple, however, remained still, her mind already sifting through the evening's events. Constable Reed, a stout, earnest man from the village of St. Mary Mead, was summoned post-haste. His arrival, marked by the creak of his polished boots and the faint scent of pipe tobacco, brought a semblance of order. He stood before the display case, a simple glass box with a brass lock, and scratched his head. "Locked tight it is," he muttered, peering at the mechanism. "No sign of tampering, far as I can see." He turned to Lady Beatrice. "When was it last seen, milady?" "Moments before the final bid," she replied, her hands twisting the lace of her shawl. Mr. Golding inspected it and missed her. Hurst announced it from the podium. It was there, sparkling for all to see. Her eyes darted to the auctioneer, who stood nearby, his moustache twitching with indignation. "Impossible," Mr. Percival Hurst declared, stepping forward with a flourish that suggested he was still on stage. "I was at my podium the entire time, overseeing every lot. The pendant was in its case when I called the final bid for Mr. Finch." His voice carried a note of affront, as if the theft were a personal slight. Miss Marple noted the gleam of his cufflinks, gold, embossed with a crest far too grand for his station, and the way his eyes flicked briefly toward Mrs. Clara Henshaw, who stood serenely near a marble pillar. Mr. Roland Finch, the winning bidder, pushed through the crowd, his broad frame cutting an imposing figure. "This is outrageous!" he bellowed, his face flushed with more than champagne. "I paid £12,000 for that jewel. Where is it?" His voice, loud enough to rattle the crystal flutes on a nearby table, drew uneasy glances. Miss Marple observed the frayed edge of his coat sleeve, an odd detail for a man of such wealth, and the way his hands clenched, as if ready to seize the pendant by force. Mr. Ezra Golding, the jeweller, hovered at the edge of the group, his thin frame almost lost in the shadow of the display case. His spectacles glinted as he adjusted them, his fingers trembling slightly. I locked the case myself," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "After I authenticated the stone, I secured it. No one could have touched it." His eyes darted to the floor, avoiding the accusing stares of the guests. Miss Marple, her knitting now folded neatly in her lap, noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, and the way he clutched his small leather satchel, as if it held more than just his tools. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, by contrast, exuded calm. Her emerald gown shimmered as she stepped forward, her fan fluttering gently. "What a dreadful turn of events," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "But surely the pendant is merely misplaced." "A jewel like that doesn't simply vanish." Her smile was sympathetic, yet Miss Marple detected a flicker of amusement in her eyes, as if she were watching a play unfold. The widow's poise was impeccable, but her handbag, monogrammed with a delicate CH, caught Miss Marple's attention. It had been near the display case earlier, she was certain. Constable Reed, out of his depth in such a glittering assembly, began questioning the guests nearest the case. "Did anyone see anything unusual?" he asked, his notebook open, pencil poised. A chorus of denials followed, each more emphatic than the last. The servants hovering at the edges of the room were summoned, but their accounts were vague, too busy with trays and coats to notice anything amiss. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily satisfied. She rose quietly, her slight figure moving unnoticed through the crowd, and approached the display case. The case itself was unremarkable. A square of tempered glass, its edges reinforced with brass, and a lock that looked sturdy but not impenetrable. The velvet cushion within was pristine, its indigo surface unmarked save for a faint indentation where the pendant had rested. Miss Marple bent closer, her spectacles catching the light, and examined the lock. No scratches, no signs of force. "Curious," she murmured. "A locked case, a crowded room, and yet the jewel is gone. This is no impulsive theft." Lady Beatrice, noticing Miss Marple's scrutiny, approached her. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "you've a knack for these things, haven't you? I recall that business with the vicar's silver last year. Can you help us?" her eyes wide with distress, held a plea that Miss Marple could not ignore. "I shall do my best," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Might I stay at Larchmont Hall for a day or two? It would be easier to observe matters closely." Lady Beatrice nodded eagerly, her relief palpable. "Of course, you shall have the blue guest room." "Anything you need, Miss Marple." As the guests dispersed, some to their motor cars, others to the drawing room for brandy and speculation, Miss Marple returned to her seat, retrieving her knitting. The room was quieter now, the servants clearing away glasses and rearranging chairs. She watched Mr. Hurst confer with Constable Reed, his gestures animated, his voice insistent. Mr. Finch lingered near the case, his expression a mixture of anger and bewilderment. Mr. Golding had slipped away, his satchel clutched tightly, while Mrs. Henshaw glided toward the French doors, pausing to exchange a word with a footman. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She considered the suspects. Hurst, with his theatrical flair and expensive tastes. Finch, whose ambition seemed to outstrip his manners. Golding, whose nervous demeanour hinted at secrets. And Mrs. Henshaw, whose charm masked a life of carefully maintained appearances. Each had been near the case at some point. Each had a motive. Greed, status, desperation, or perhaps something more personal. She recalled the auction's final moments. Hurst's booming call, Finch's triumphant bid, Golding's fleeting absence to adjust the case, and Mrs. Henshaw's slow stroll past the display. The pendant had been visible then, its diamond catching every eye. Yet now it was gone, spirited away under the noses of 100 guests. A clever trick, Miss Marple thought, and one that required planning. But whose? She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and approached Constable Reed. "Might I suggest," she said mildly, "that you check the guest list against those who lingered near the case after the bidding? And perhaps examine the case for any unusual marks." Reed blinked, unaccustomed to such suggestions from an elderly lady, but nodded. "Right you are, miss." "I'll have a look." As she made her way to the hall, where Lady Beatrice was arranging her stay, Miss Marple's mind turned to the village of St. Mary Mead. She thought of her neighbour, Mrs. Price, who had once lost a brooch only to find it pinned to her own shawl. A simple oversight. But this was no oversight. The Star of Avalon was a prize, and its theft was deliberate. People are much the same everywhere, she mused, whether in a village or a grand hall. They want, they scheme, and they betray themselves in the smallest ways. She glanced back at the ballroom, now nearly empty. The display case stood like a silent witness, its empty cushion a challenge. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A jewel doesn't vanish," she thought. "It's taken. And I shall find out by whom. Chapter 3. The Auctioneer's Tale. The morning after the theft dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Larchmont Hall's morning room. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table, her knitting spread before her like a map of her thoughts, each stitch a marker of observation. The room was quiet, save for the occasional clink of china as a maid served tea. Lady Beatrice Worthington, still shaken by the previous evening's calamity, had insisted Miss Marple begin her inquiries at once, and so the elderly spinster had requested a private word with Mr. Percival Hurst, the auctioneer. Mr. Hurst arrived promptly at 10, his moustache impeccably waxed, his navy suit pressed to a fault. He carried himself with the air of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Yet Miss Marple noted a faint tightness around his eyes, a suggestion of strain beneath his polished exterior. He took the offered seat, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate ease, and fixed her with a smile that was more performance than warmth. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice resonant, as if addressing a crowd rather than a single listener. "I trust you slept well, despite the unfortunate events. How may I assist you?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her hands moving with the unhurried rhythm of habit. "Oh, quite well, thank you, Mr. Hurst," she replied, her tone mild as milk. "I find a good night's rest sharpens the mind, don't you? I was hoping you might share your account of last evening. You were, after all, at the heart of the auction." Hurst's chest puffed slightly, as if flattered by the implication of his centrality. "Indeed I was," he said. "My role demanded absolute vigilance. From my podium, I had a clear view of the room, the bidders and, of course, the display case containing the Star of Avalon. I assure you, Miss Marple, the pendant was secure when I announced Mr. Finch's winning bid." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. "How fascinating," she said. "You must have remarkable focus, Mr. Hurst, to manage such a lively crowd and keep watch over the jewel. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual during the bidding? A guest lingering too long, perhaps, or an odd movement near the case?" Hurst's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks, gold, embossed with a crest that seemed to belong to a grander lineage than his own. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said firmly. "The room was full, the bidding spirited. I was occupied with calling the lots, ensuring the pace didn't flag. The pendant was in its case, locked by Mr. Golding himself, and I saw no one tamper with it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing as she reached for her tea. "Locked by Mr. Golding," she repeated thoughtfully. "And you remained at the podium throughout?" "Not a moment's absence. Not a moment," Hurst declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "My duty was to the auction, and I take my responsibilities seriously. The Star of Avalon was the evening's crown jewel, and I was determined to see it sold fairly." "Admirable," Miss Marple said, her tone so gentle it might have been mistaken for agreement. She sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Hurst's face. "And after the bidding, when the pendant was discovered missing, where were you then?" Hurst's moustache twitched, and he shifted in his chair. "I was speaking with Constable Reed, assisting with his initial inquiries." The room was in an uproar. "As you can imagine, I stayed near the podium, ensuring the other lots were secure." He paused, then added, "I've conducted dozens of auctions, Miss Marple." "Never have I seen such a thing. It's a scandal, frankly. A scandal indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft. She set her cup down and resumed knitting, her fingers moving with quiet precision. "You must know many of the guests, Mr. Hurst, being so experienced. Mr. Finch, for instance. Quite an enthusiastic bidder, wasn't he?" Hurst chuckled, a sound that carried a hint of disdain. "Enthusiastic, yes, but hardly refined. New money, you know. Always eager to make a splash. He was determined to have that pendant, though I can't say why. Perhaps to impress someone." His eyes flickered, as if he'd said more than intended. "And Mrs. Henshaw?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "She seemed quite taken with the pendant, lingering near the case before the auction began." Hurst's expression tightened, and he adjusted his tie. "Mrs. Henshaw is a lady of taste," he said carefully. "She often attends such events, admiring the finer lots. I saw her near the case, yes, but only briefly. She was merely appreciating the jewel, as many did." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with what might have been amusement. "Of course," she said, "and Mr. Golding? He must rely on you to present his authentications with flair. You two work closely, I presume?" Hurst's smile returned, though it was less assured. "Mr. Golding is a professional," he said. "He certified the pendant's value, and I ensured it was properly showcased. Our roles complement each other." He leaned forward, his tone earnest. "Miss Marple, I assure you my attention never wavered. If there was a thief, they slipped past us all." "How vexing," Miss Marple said, her voice tinged with sympathy. "But you've been most helpful, Mr. Hurst. One last thing. Your cufflinks are quite striking. A family heirloom, perhaps?" Hurst glanced at his wrists, his fingers brushing the gold. "A gift," he said shortly, "from a grateful client." He rose, bowing slightly. "If you'll excuse me, I must assist Lady Beatrice with the inventory of remaining lots." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking once more. "Thank you, Mr. Hurst." As he departed, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind turning over the conversation. Hurst's account was polished, almost rehearsed, and his insistence on his vigilance struck her as a touch too fervent. Those cufflinks, too, were curious, far beyond an auctioneer's means, suggesting either extravagance or connections he hadn't mentioned. And that glance toward Mrs. Henshaw during the auction, brief but deliberate, lingered in her memory. She thought of her nephew Raymond's friend, a young man who fancied himself an actor, and whose performances were always a shade too emphatic when he had something to hide. Mr. Hurst, she mused, is playing a part. But is it that of a thief, or merely a man with secrets? She tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, resolved to speak next with Mr. Finch. The auctioneer's tale was clear, but clarity, she knew, could be its own kind of disguise. Chapter 4. The Bidder's Ambition. The late morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Larchmont Hall's library, casting dappled patterns on the oak-panelled walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed armchair, her knitting resting in her lap, the soft click of her needles momentarily stilled. The room smelled faintly of old leather and beeswax, its shelves lined with volumes that spoke of the Worthington family's long history. She had chosen this quiet corner for her next conversation with Mr. Roland Finch, the brash industrialist who had won the bid for the Star of Avalon, only to see it vanish before he could claim it. His loud presence at the auction had drawn her attention, and she was curious to learn what lay beneath his bluster. Mr. Finch entered with the force of a gale, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His suit, though finely tailored, bore signs of carelessness. A button strained at his waist, and the lining of his coat showed a tear that Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted at once. He flung himself into the chair opposite her, his face still flushed from the previous evening's indignation. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, his voice booming even in the hushed library, "I hope you've got some answers." £12,000 I bid for that pendant, and now it's gone. It's a disgrace, that's what it is. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as a summer afternoon. "A great misfortune, Mr. Finch," she said, her tone soothing. "I'm sure it's most distressing." Perhaps you could tell me about your interest in the Star of Avalon. It was quite a spirited bid you made." Finch leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Spirited? I meant to have it, and I would have, if not for this blasted theft. It was for my fiancée, you see, a gift to mark our engagement." His eyes, a pale grey, met hers briefly before darting to the window, as if seeking escape. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm. "How charming," she said. "Your fiancée must be delighted by such devotion." "May I ask her name? I don't recall hearing of an engagement in the village." Her voice was gentle, but her question carried the precision of a well-aimed dart. Finch's flush deepened, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it's not official yet," he muttered. "Miss Eleanor Vance, from London. We've been corresponding, and I thought the pendant would seal things, you might say." He forced a grin, but it faltered under Miss Marple's steady gaze. "How thoughtful," she said, her tone unchanged. "And the pendant's value? Beyond its beauty, I mean. Did that influence your bid? I understand you're a man of considerable means, Mr. Finch, but £12,000 is no small sum." He bristled, his chest puffing out. "I can afford it, if that's what you're getting at. My steelworks are thriving. Orders from Birmingham to Glasgow. I bid on the pendant because it's a rare piece, an investment as much as a gift. A man in my position needs to make a mark, show he's arrived." His voice carried a note of defiance, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tugged at the torn lining of his coat. A nervous gesture that belied his confidence. "Quite so," she said, her eyes crinkling with what might have been amusement. "And during the auction, you were seated near the front, weren't you? Did you notice anyone near the display case? Perhaps someone who seemed out of place?" Finch frowned, his brow furrowing, as if the question required effort. "I was focused on the bidding," he said. "Hurst was calling the lots, and I was watching him and that jeweller fellow Golding. He was fussing with the case before the auction started, you know. Said he was checking the stone. Seemed a bit twitchy, if you ask me." He paused, then added, "And that misses." Henshaw was floating about, all smiles and silk. She passed the case a few times, but I didn't think much of it. Everyone was gawking at the diamond. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Misses. Henshaw does have a certain presence," she said, "and Mr. Hurst. Did he seem his usual self? You've attended his auctions before, I presume?" "A few," Finch admitted. "He's always got that showman's air, strutting about like he owns the place." Last night was no different, though he kept looking at Mrs. Henshaw, now I think of it. Probably just admiring her. She's a looker for her age. He chuckled, a coarse sound that grated in the quiet room. Miss Marple's smile remained fixed, but her mind was busy. She recalled Finch's behaviour at the auction, his loud bids, his clenched fists, the way he'd loomed over the other bidders as if to intimidate them. And that torn coat lining, odd for a man who boasted of wealth. She thought of young Tommy Pierce from St. Mary Mead, who had once torn his jacket climbing a tree to impress a girl, only to reveal he'd been sneaking apples from the vicar's orchard. Ambition, she knew, could lead to reckless acts, and Finch's ambition was as clear as the diamond he'd failed to claim. "Tell me, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice as gentle as ever. "After the auction, when the theft was discovered, where were you? I imagine you were eager to see the pendant you'd won." Finch's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, crossing his arms. "I was right there, near the case, demanding to know what was going on. That constable was poking about, asking useless questions. I told him I hadn't seen anything. I was too busy celebrating my win. His voice carried a note of petulance, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, fixing instead on a bust of Lord Worthington across the room. "Of course," she said, "it must have been a shock. And your coat, such a fine cut, but it seems to have suffered a tear. Did that happen during the commotion?" Finch's hand flew to his sleeve, his fingers brushing the frayed lining. "This? Oh, caught it on a chair or something. These things happen." His laugh was forced, and he stood abruptly, as if eager to end the conversation. "Look, Miss Marple, I'm no detective, but I want that pendant found. I paid for it, and I expect results. If you'll excuse me, I've business to attend to, naturally," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing as she looked up at him. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Finch. You've been most illuminating." As he strode out, his heavy footsteps echoing on the parquet floor, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind turning over the encounter. Finch's story was plausible, but his manner was too defensive, his fiancée too vague. That torn coat, she thought, was no accident. It suggested haste, perhaps a struggle, or a hurried movement near the display case. And his mention of Golding's nervousness and Mrs. Henshaw's presence added new threads to the tapestry she was weaving. She thought of her neighbour, Mrs. Clement, whose husband had once boasted of a business deal that turned out to be more bluster than substance. Finch, she suspected, was a man who wanted to be seen as more than he was. A dangerous trait when a prize like the Star of Avalon was at stake. "Ambition can blind," she murmured, "but does it steal?" She tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, resolved to speak next with Mr. Golding. The jeweller's role in authenticating the pendant and his access to the case made him a figure worth closer scrutiny. Chapter 5. The Jeweller's Craft. The afternoon light spilled through the tall windows of Larchmont Hall's conservatory, where Miss Jane Marple had arranged to meet Mr. Ezra Golding. The conservatory, with its lush ferns and delicate orchids, offered a serene contrast to the tension that still lingered from the previous evening's theft. Miss Marple sat on a wicker chair, her knitting bag at her side, her needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, but her attention was fixed on the task at hand, unravelling the mystery of the Star of Avalon's disappearance. Mr. Golding, the jeweller who had authenticated the pendant, was a key figure, and she was eager to probe his account. Mr. Golding entered hesitantly, his thin frame almost swallowed by the conservatory's greenery. His spectacles sat low on his nose, and his hands clutched a small leather satchel, its edges worn from years of use. His grey suit was immaculate, but slightly threadbare, hinting at a man whose fortunes had seen better days. He took the seat opposite Miss Marple, his movements jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice high and strained, "I understand you're looking into this dreadful business. I'll help however I can, though I'm not sure what more I can add." Miss Marple's smile was as gentle as a spring breeze. "How kind of you, Mr. Golding," she said, her needles clicking softly. "I'm sure you're as eager as anyone to see the pendant recovered. Your role last evening was quite important, wasn't it? Authenticating such a valuable jewel must carry great responsibility." Golding nodded, pushing his spectacles up with a trembling finger. "Oh yes," he said, "the Star of Avalon is exceptional. A 12-carat diamond, flawless, with a clarity that's rare even among fine stones. I examined it thoroughly before the auction, as Lady Beatrice requested. It was genuine, I assure you." His words came quickly, almost too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. "How fascinating," she said, her tone encouraging. "You must have a keen eye for such work. Tell me, what did your examination involve? I'm afraid I know so little about jewels, though I do admire them." Golding relaxed slightly, as if relieved to speak of his craft. "It's a meticulous process," he said. "I used a loupe to check for inclusions, tiny flaws within the stone. The star had none. I also verified its cut and weight against the documentation provided. Everything was in order, so I locked it in the display case myself about an hour before the auction began." He paused, his fingers tightening on his satchel. "The key was handed to Mr. Hurst, and that was the last I saw of it." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she tilted her head, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Locked by you," she said thoughtfully, "and the case was secure. No one could have accessed it without the key." "None," Golding said firmly, though his voice wavered. "The lock is a sturdy brass mechanism, designed for such purposes. I checked it twice, as is my habit. No one could have opened it without breaking the glass, and there was no sign of that. Most reassuring," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "And during the auction, where were you? I recall seeing you near the case at one point, perhaps adjusting something." Golding's face paled, and he adjusted his spectacles again, a nervous tic. I was seated near the front," he said. "I stepped up once, just before the bidding for the pendant began, to ensure the case was properly lit. The diamond's brilliance needed to be shown to its best advantage, you see. But I was only there a moment, and the case was locked when I returned to my seat." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Of course," she said, "lighting is so important for such a jewel. And you noticed nothing unusual? No one lingering near the case, perhaps, or anything out of place?" Golding shook his head, his fingers now drumming lightly on his satchel. "Nothing," he said. "The room was crowded, and everyone was focused on Mr. Hurst. Mr. Finch was bidding loudly, and Mrs. Henshaw was nearby, but only to admire the pendant, I think. It was all quite ordinary until the theft was discovered." "Quite extraordinary, really," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his. "You must feel such a weight, Mr. Golding, being responsible for the pendant's authenticity. I understand your shop in London has faced some challenges lately. It can't be easy, maintaining such a reputation in difficult times." Golding's face twitched, and he clutched his satchel tighter. "It's true," he admitted, his voice low. "The trade has been slow. People aren't buying fine jewels as they once did. But I've managed, and my work for Lady Beatrice is an honour." His words were earnest, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if her question had struck too close to a hidden wound. She thought of Mr. Weatherby, the greengrocer in St. Mary Mead, who had once tried to pass off bruised apples as fresh, his hands trembling as he spoke of his debts. Golding's nervousness was similar, and his satchel, she noted, was unusually bulky for a man who claimed to carry only tools. "Your dedication is admirable," she said, "and your tools, such precision they must require. I noticed your satchel earlier. Did you always carry it with you?" Golding's hand tightened on the leather. "Always," he said quickly. "A jeweller's tools are his livelihood. Loop calipers, a small scale. I never leave them behind." He forced a smile, but it was strained, and Miss Marple noted a faint smudge on the satchel's clasp, as if it had been handled with something waxy. "How wise," she said, her needles clicking again. "One last thing, Mr. Golding, did you happen to speak with Mr. Hurst or Mrs. Henshaw during the evening? They both seemed quite involved in the auction's success." Golding hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. "Only briefly," he said. "Mr. Hurst asked me to confirm the pendant's details before he announced it, and Mrs. Henshaw, well, she complimented my work. She's a gracious lady, always interested in fine things." His voice trailed off, and he stood abruptly. "If there's nothing else, Miss Marple, I should check on the other lots." Lady Beatrice asked me to verify their condition. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Golding. Thank you." As he hurried out, his footsteps light but hurried on the tiled floor. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind sifting through the conversation. Golding's account was detailed, almost too detailed, and his nervousness was palpable. That smudge on his satchel, she thought, could be wax, perhaps from moulding a replica, though such a thought was speculative. His debts hinted at in village gossip suggested a motive, and his access to the case gave him opportunity. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's cousin, who had once pawned a family heirloom to save his shop, only to be caught when the pawned item surfaced at an auction. "A man in debt," she murmured, "sees a jewel differently." She tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, her thoughts turning to Mrs. Henshaw. The widow's charm and her proximity to the case warranted closer attention. Golding's twitchy demeanour had revealed much, but Miss Marple knew the truth lay in the interplay of all the players. "A jewel doesn't vanish," she thought, "but a man's desperation might make it seem so." She resolved to speak with Mrs. Henshaw next, her mind already threading together the clues of ambition, debt, and charm. Chapter 6. The Guest's Charm. The late afternoon sun bathed Larchmont Hall's rose garden in a soft rosy glow, the air fragrant with blooming petals and freshly cut grass. Miss Jane Marple had chosen this tranquil setting for her conversation with Mrs. Clara Henshaw, the elegant widow whose serene demeanour at the auction had piqued her curiosity. Seated on a wrought-iron bench, her knitting bag nestled beside her, Miss Marple worked her needles with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The garden's quiet beauty was a stark contrast to the turmoil of the stolen Star of Avalon. Yet it provided the perfect backdrop for her gentle probing. A setting where secrets might slip as easily as a petal falls. Mrs. Henshaw approached with the grace of a dancer, her emerald gown replaced by a tailored cream dress that accentuated her silver hair, swept into a flawless chignon. Her smile was warm, almost intimate, as she took the seat opposite Miss Marple, her ivory fan resting lightly in her lap. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth as velvet, "what a delightful spot for a chat. I do hope I can be of some help with this dreadful affair. The loss of such a jewel, it's quite shocking." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a smile, her needles clicking softly. "Indeed, Mrs. Henshaw," she replied, her tone as gentle as the breeze stirring the roses. "It's most unsettling, especially in such a distinguished gathering. You were at the auction, of course, and I couldn't help but notice your poise amidst the excitement. Perhaps you could share what you saw that evening." Mrs. Henshaw's fan fluttered briefly, a delicate motion that seemed almost instinctive. "I'm flattered you noticed," she said, her smile unwavering. "I was merely a guest, enjoying the spectacle." The Star of Avalon was exquisite, naturally, and I admired it from afar, like so many others. I sat near the back, watching Mr. Hurst's performance. He does have a flair, doesn't he? And Mr. Finch, of course, made quite a show with his bids. Her voice carried a hint of amusement, as if she were recounting a diverting play. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing as she reached for her small notebook, a habit she maintained for such inquiries. "Mr. Hurst does command attention," she said, "and you were near the display case at one point, weren't you? I seem to recall you passing by before the bidding began." Mrs. Henshaw's smile tightened, but only for a moment. "Oh, yes," she said lightly. "I couldn't resist a closer look." The diamond was breathtaking, sparkling under the lights. I lingered for a moment, but I assure you, I was nowhere near when the theft occurred. I was back in my seat by then, enjoying the drama of the bids. Her fan moved again, a slow arc that seemed to deflect scrutiny. "How understandable," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as ever. "A jewel like that draws the eye. Did you notice anyone else near the case? Mr. Golding, perhaps? Or Mr. Finch?" Mrs. Henshaw tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Golding was there earlier, fussing with the case. Something about the lock, I believe. He seemed rather anxious, poor man. And Mr. Finch was pacing about after his bid, but he was too caught up in his triumph to notice much else. The room was so crowded, Miss Marple, it's hard to say who might have lingered." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words, as if each were a step on a well-trodden path. "Quite so," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "It must be difficult, maintaining such composure in such a lively setting. I understand your late husband was fond of fine things, jewels perhaps. It must bring back memories, attending such events." Mrs. Henshaw's fan paused, and her smile grew wistful. "Dear Harold," she said, "he did love beauty, art, music, jewels. But I'm afraid his tastes outstripped his means in the end. I attend these auctions more for the company than the bidding. A widow must keep up appearances, you know." Her laugh was soft, almost self-deprecating, but Miss Marple caught the faint edge in it, like a crack in fine porcelain. "Appearances are so important," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "I couldn't help but notice your handbag last evening, so elegant with that lovely monogram. I believe I saw a handkerchief with the same initials near the display case. Yours, perhaps?" Mrs. Henshaw's hand stilled, and for a fraction of a second her composure wavered. "My handkerchief," she said, her voice light but strained. "Oh, I may have dropped one. I was near the case, as I said, and these things do slip from one's hand. But I assure you, Miss Marple, I had no part in this theft. I'm as shocked as anyone." She opened her fan fully, as if to shield herself from further questions. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "It's easily done, dropping a handkerchief. I once lost one myself at a church bazaar in St. Mary Mead. Such a fuss it caused, though it was only found under a table. But tell me, did you speak with Mr. Hurst or Mr. Golding during the evening?" They both seemed quite involved with the pendant. Mrs. Henshaw's fan resumed its gentle motion. "Only in passing," she said. "Mr. Hurst was kind enough to explain the auction's highlights to me before it began. He's so enthusiastic, you know. And Mr. Golding, I complimented his expertise. He seemed rather flustered, but I suppose that's natural, handling such a valuable piece. Her tone was casual, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked toward the garden path, as if eager to move on. "How kind of you," Miss Marple said. "You must know many of the guests, being a regular at such events. Mr. Finch, for instance. His enthusiasm was quite striking, wasn't it?" Mrs. Henshaw laughed, a silvery sound that echoed among the roses. "Oh, Mr. Finch is a force of nature," she said. "All that bluster and bravado. He's new to this world, you can tell. He wants to be noticed, and that pendant was his way of shouting it." Her tone was indulgent, but Miss Marple detected a trace of disdain, carefully masked. She thought of Mrs. Price from St. Mary Mead, whose charm at the village fete hid a sharp tongue when gossiping about her rivals. Mrs. Henshaw's poise was similar, a polished surface over something less serene. That handkerchief with its monogram was a small clue, but its placement near the case suggested either carelessness or calculation. And her mention of Golding's anxiety and Hurst's enthusiasm added new shades to the picture forming in Miss Marple's mind. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple said, tucking her knitting into her bag. "I shan't keep you from enjoying this lovely garden." "Thank you for your time," Mrs. Henshaw rose, her smile as radiant as ever. "A pleasure, Miss Marple," she said. "I do hope you find that pendant. It would be such a shame for it to be lost forever." She glided away, her cream dress blending with the sunlight, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. As the widow's footsteps faded, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind sifting through the conversation. Mrs. Henshaw's charm was a shield, deflecting questions with ease, but that moment of unease over the handkerchief had been telling. Her financial straits, hinted at in village whispers, suggested a motive, and her proximity to the case offered opportunity. Yet her composure was nearly flawless, unlike Golding's nervous tics or Finch's bluster. "Charm," Miss Marple murmured, "is a marvellous mask, but it rarely hides everything." She rose, her thoughts turning to the display case itself. A closer examination was in order, to see what secrets its glass and lock might hold. The threads of the mystery, Hurst's theatrics, Finch's ambition, Golding's debts and Mrs. Henshaw's elegance were weaving together, but the pattern was not yet clear. A jewel is only part of the story, she thought. The rest lies in the hands that reached for it. Chapter 7. The Scene of the Crime. The early evening light cast long shadows across the ballroom of Larchmont Hall, where the theft of the Star of Avalon had turned a night of elegance into one of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, stood before the display case that had once held the diamond pendant. The room was quiet now. The guests dispersed to their rooms or the village, leaving only the faint echo of last night's clamour. The chandeliers, unlit, hung like silent sentinels, and the polished oak floor reflected the fading sun. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, studied the case with the patience of one accustomed to finding truth in the smallest details. The display case was a simple affair. A cube of tempered glass, its edges framed in brass, standing on a low pedestal draped in indigo velvet. The lock, a sturdy brass mechanism, showed no obvious signs of tampering, as Constable Reed had noted. Yet Miss Marple bent closer, her slight figure casting a shadow across the glass. She adjusted her spectacles and examined the lock's surface, her fingers hovering just above it. There, almost imperceptible, was a faint scratch. A single fine line, as if a tool had grazed it. Not forced, she murmured, but touched, perhaps in haste. She straightened, her mind turning to the evening of the auction. The case had stood at the room's centre, visible to all, yet the pendant had vanished without a sound. She pictured the scene. Mr. Percival Hurst at his podium, his voice booming. Mr. Roland Finch, flushed with triumph after his bid. Mr. Ezra Golding, fidgeting near the case, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw, gliding past with her enigmatic smile. The crowd had been dense, a swirl of silk and cigarette smoke, yet no one had reported a commotion, no broken glass, no cry of alarm. A clever thief, she thought, or one who knew the case's secrets. Miss Marple circled the pedestal, her steps slow and deliberate. The velvet cushion within the case was pristine, its indentation a ghostly reminder of the missing jewel. She noted a smudge on the glass, high up, near the top edge. Too high for a casual touch, unless someone had reached deliberately, perhaps standing on something to gain height. She glanced at the floor, but the polished oak revealed no scuffs or marks. A chair, perhaps, she mused, or someone tall, like Mr. Finch. She made a mental note to check the guest list for others of notable height. The ballroom's layout offered few hiding places. The French doors led to a terrace, but they had been guarded by footmen during the auction. The windows were high and latched, and the only other exit was a service door near the back, used by the servants. Miss Marple approached it, her eyes scanning the frame. A faint smudge of wax, barely visible, clung to the handle. She leaned closer, her nose wrinkling at the faint scent of beeswax. "Curious," she said softly. "Wax, like Mr. Golding's satchel." She recalled his nervous demeanour, the smudge on his clasp, and wondered if his tools had been used for more than authentication. Returning to the case, she considered the lock again. Its simplicity was deceptive. A skilled hand with the right tool might open it without force. She thought of Mr. Golding's expertise, his access to the key and his debts, whispered about in the village. But Mrs. Henshaw's handkerchief found near the case suggested another possibility, a distraction perhaps, or a deliberate misdirection. And Mr. Hurst, with his theatrical oversight, had been too insistent on his vigilance, his cufflinks hinting at extravagance beyond his means. Mr. Finch's torn coat, too, suggested haste or struggle, though his bluster seemed more about status than stealth. Miss Marple stepped back, her hands clasped behind her. She thought of a theft in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a silver teapot vanished from the vicarage during a fete. It had been found in a gardener's shed, hidden by a boy who thought it would buy him a bicycle. The motive had been simple, the method crude. But this theft was neither. "A diamond doesn't vanish," she murmured. "It's taken, with planning and precision." She approached Constable Reed, who was lingering near the ballroom's entrance, his notebook open but largely blank. "Constable," she said, her voice gentle, "might I suggest examining the service door? There's a mark, wax, I believe, that might be of interest, and perhaps you could confirm who had access to the case's key before the auction." Reed blinked, his moustache twitching with surprise. "Wax, you say? Right, I'll have a look, Miss Marple. As for the key, Mr. Golding handed it to Mr. Hurst, and Hurst says he kept it in his pocket until the case was opened after the theft. He scribbled a note, his faith in Miss Marple's instincts growing despite his initial skepticism. "Thank you, Constable," she said, her smile warm. "And one more thing. Could you provide me with the guest list? I'd like to know who was seated closest to the case, and who might have lingered after the bidding." Reed nodded, promising to deliver the list by morning. As he bustled off, Miss Marple returned to the case, her mind weaving together the threads of the evening. The scratch on the lock, the smudge on the glass, the wax on the door. Each was a clue, small but significant, like the dropped stitches she sometimes found in her knitting. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, who once overlooked a smudge of jam on a letter, only to realize it pointed to a child's mischief. Details, Miss Marple thought, are the threads of truth. She glanced at the ballroom's high ceiling, picturing the crowd's movements. The thief had acted swiftly, under the cover of the auction's chaos, yet without drawing attention. Not magic, she said to herself, but method. She resolved to speak with the servants next, for their eyes, often unnoticed, saw more than the guests realized. The puzzle was taking shape, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of its pieces falling into place, one careful observation at a time. Chapter 8. Whispers and Motives. The drawing-room of Larchmont Hall was a haven of warmth as dusk settled over the estate, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Worthington ancestors, gazing down upon the present intrigue. A fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the damask upholstery, and the faint aroma of sandalwood mingled with the scent of freshly brewed tea. Miss Jane Marple sat in a plush armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, her needles moving with their usual rhythmic precision. She had requested a moment to take tea with Lady Beatrice Worthington, knowing that the servants, ever present yet often unseen, would be nearby, their whispers a rich tapestry of clues waiting to be unravelled. Lady Beatrice, her nerves still frayed from the theft of the Star of Avalon, poured tea with a trembling hand, the delicate porcelain cup clinking against its saucer. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "this dreadful business has quite undone me." The pendant was to fund the new wing for the village hospital. It wasn't even insured, such a ruinous loss. Her eyes, wide with distress, sought Miss Marple's calm gaze for reassurance. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a gentle smile, her eyes crinkling with sympathy. "A terrible shock, Lady Beatrice," she said, "but I find that in such matters the smallest details often lead to the truth. Your staff, for instance, they see so much, don't they? Might I have a word with one or two, just to hear their observations?" "Of course," Lady Beatrice said, ringing a small silver bell. "They're all dreadfully upset, but I'm sure they'll do their best to help." She paused, then added, "You've such a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I do hope you can make sense of this." As the butler ushered in a young footman, Miss Marple set her tea aside, her needles pausing. The footman, a lanky lad named Thomas, stood awkwardly, his polished shoes gleaming, but his expression uneasy. "You wanted me, ma'am?" he asked, glancing between Lady Beatrice and Miss Marple. "Yes, Thomas," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "I'm trying to piece together last night's events. You were in the ballroom during the auction, weren't you? Serving drinks, perhaps?" Thomas nodded, his hands clasped behind his back. "Yes, miss." "I was carrying trays of champagne, going round the guests. It was a right busy night, with all the bidding and such." Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. "I'm sure it was," she said. "And the display case with the pendant. Did you pass by it often? Did you notice anyone lingering nearby?" Thomas frowned, his brow creasing as he thought. "I passed it a few times, miss, but I wasn't watching close. Mr. Golding was there before the auction, checking the lock, like he always does with the fine lots. Looked a bit nervy, if you don't mind me saying. And Mrs. Henshaw, she stopped by the case once or twice, smiling like she does. I saw her talking to Mr. Hurst later, near the French doors. They seemed friendly, like his cheeks flushed, and he looked down, as if realizing he'd said too much. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained mild. Friendly, you say? How interesting. And Mr. Hurst, did he leave his podium at any point? Not that I saw, miss, Thomas said. He was up there, calling the bids, all grand and loud. But I heard him and Mrs. Henshaw talking later, after the theft was found out. Something about meeting in town next week. Didn't think much of it, but... He trailed off, shrugging. Thank you, Thomas, Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. You've a good eye. If you remember anything else, do tell me. As Thomas retreated, Miss Marple turned to Lady Beatrice. Might I speak with one of the maids? Ellie, perhaps. She was so helpful earlier. Lady Beatrice nodded, and soon Ellie appeared, her freckled face nervous but eager. She curtsied, clutching her apron. Miss Marple, ma'am, she said, I ain't in trouble, am I? Not at all, my dear, Miss Marple said, her tone warm. I only want to hear what you saw last night. You were serving in the ballroom, weren't you? Ellie nodded vigorously. Yes, miss, with the champagne and canapes. I saw Mr. Finch stomping about after he won the bid, all proud-like, but cross when the pendant was gone. He was near the case, shouting at the constable, and Mr. Golding, he was pacing before the auction, muttering to himself. I heard him say something about too much at stake. Made me think he was worried about more than just the jewel. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she leaned forward slightly. How perceptive of you, Ellie, she said, and Mrs. Henshaw. Did you see her with anyone? Ellie's eyes widened. Oh, yes, miss. She was chatting with Mr. Hurst, like Thomas said. They was by the terrace doors, late in the evening. She laughed a lot, and he looked, well, smitten, if you'll pardon me. And I saw her drop a handkerchief near the case earlier, but she didn't pick it up. I meant to. But then the theft happened, and I forgot. Miss Marple's smile deepened. A handkerchief, she said softly. How easily such things are overlooked. And Mr. Golding, did you see him near the case after his initial inspection? Once, miss, Ellie said. Just before the bidding started, he went to adjust the light or something. He was only there a moment, then back to his seat. Looked proper anxious, though, fiddling with his satchel. You've been most helpful, Ellie, Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. Don't let me keep you from your duties. As Ellie scurried off, Lady Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes anxious. Do you think the servants saw something important, Miss Marple? They're such good souls, but they do gossip. Gossip is often the seed of truth, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. Your staff have given me much to consider. Might I have a copy of the guest list? I'd like to know who was near the case after the bidding. Of course, Lady Beatrice said, ringing for the butler. Anything you need, Miss Marple. As the butler departed to fetch the list, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving together the servants' accounts. Thomas's mention of Hurst and Mrs. Henshaw's friendly exchange hinted at a connection beyond mere acquaintance, perhaps an alliance, or something more personal. Ellie's observation of Golding's muttering and Finch's temper added new layers to their motives. The handkerchief, monogrammed and left near the case, was a tantalizing clue, though it might be nothing more than carelessness. She thought of Mrs. Clement's maid in St. Mary Mead, who had once overheard a crucial conversation while polishing silver, revealing a neighbour's secret affair. Servants, Miss Marple knew, were the unseen eyes of a great house. When the guest list arrived, Miss Marple scanned it carefully, noting the names of those seated closest to the case: Finch, Golding, Mrs. Henshaw, and a few others who had faded into the background of her inquiries. She also requested a list of the staff on duty, cross-referencing their positions during the auction. The ballroom's layout, she recalled, offered few hiding places, yet the pendant had vanished under 100 watchful eyes. She set the lists aside, her thoughts turning to motives. Hurst's extravagance, evident in his gold cufflinks, suggested a need for funds or favour. Finch's ambition, tied to a vague fiancée and a torn coat, hinted at a man desperate to prove himself. Golding's debts, confirmed by Ellie's overheard remark, pointed to desperation. And Mrs. Henshaw, with her charm and precarious finances, might have seen the pendant as a means to secure her future. "Everyone has a reason," Miss Marple murmured, "but only one had the means." She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and thanked Lady Beatrice for her hospitality. "I shall take a short walk before dinner," she said, "to clear my thoughts." As she stepped into the hall, her mind was anything but clear. It was alive with the threads of suspicion, each leading to a suspect, each waiting to be tied into the truth. The next step, she decided, was to revisit Mr. Golding. His nervous demeanour and access to the case made him a figure of particular interest, and she sensed he held a piece of the puzzle she had yet to uncover. Chapter 9. The Jeweller's Secret. The soft glow of lamplight bathed the small study, where Miss Jane Marple had requested a second meeting with Mr. Ezra Golding. The room, tucked away on the second floor of Larchmont Hall, was a cosy retreat from the grandeur of the main rooms, its walls lined with books and a single window overlooking the darkened gardens. Miss Marple sat in a cushioned chair, her knitting bag at her side, her needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. She had chosen this intimate setting to put the nervous jeweller at ease, sensing that his unease held the key to unlocking the mystery of the Star of Avalon's disappearance. Mr. Golding entered, his thin frame stooped as if carrying an invisible burden. His spectacles slipped down his nose, and his hands clutched his worn leather satchel, its surface betraying the faint waxy smudge Miss Marple had noted earlier. He took the seat opposite her, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting an ambush. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice high and unsteady, I hope I can assist you further. This business with the pendant is most distressing." Miss Marple's smile was as gentle as a summer dawn. "Indeed it is, Mr. Golding," she said, her needles clicking softly. "You've been so helpful already, but I thought we might revisit a few details. Your expertise with the Star of Avalon is crucial, you know. Such a responsibility, handling a jewel of that value." Golding nodded, his fingers tightening on his satchel. "It was an honour," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I took every precaution, as I told you." The pendant was genuine, the case secure. I can't imagine how it was taken." His eyes avoided hers, fixing instead on the flickering lamp. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Of course," she said, "your care is evident." "But I was wondering about the lock on the display case. You locked it yourself, you said, but I noticed a tiny scratch near the keyhole. Barely visible, really. But it made me think of a jeweller's tools. So precise, so delicate. Could such a mark come from your work, perhaps?" Golding's face paled, and his spectacles slipped further, nearly falling. He pushed them up with a trembling hand. "A scratch?" he stammered. I didn't notice. I used the key, nothing more. My tools are for examining stones, not locks. I assure you, Miss Marple, I had no part in this." His voice rose, a note of panic creeping in. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kindly concern. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't, Mr. Golding," she said, "but you'll forgive an old lady's curiosity. Your satchel, for instance, it's quite full, isn't it? I noticed a smudge on the clasp, almost like wax. It put me in mind of a jeweller's mould, the kind used for crafting replicas. You must know of such techniques, being so skilled." Golding's hands tightened on the satchel, and a bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. "Wax?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's nothing. Just polish from my tools. I use wax sometimes to clean my loop. Nothing to do with moulds or replicas." He forced a laugh, but it was brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. Miss Marple nodded, her smile unwavering. "How practical," she said. "And your examination of the pendant, did it involve any such materials? I'm so ignorant of these things, but I imagine crafting a replica would be a complex task, requiring great skill." Golding's eyes widened, and he leaned back, as if retreating from her words. "A replica," he said, his voice shrill. "I would never— Miss Marple, I'm a reputable jeweller. My shop may be struggling, but I'd never stoop to such a thing. The Star of Avalon was real, I swear it. I locked it in the case, and I left it there." His words tumbled out, too fast, too fervent. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft clicks a counterpoint to his agitation. "Of course," she said soothingly. "I only ask because you mentioned your shop's difficulties. It must be so hard, keeping up with such a demanding trade. I heard in the village, such gossip, you know, that you've had some financial troubles. A jewel like the Star could be tempting, couldn't it?" Golding's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his hands, his satchel slipping to the floor with a soft thud. "It's true," he whispered, his voice muffled. "The shop is failing. Debts piling up, creditors at my door, but I didn't steal the pendant, Miss Marple. I couldn't. My reputation is all I have left." He looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I examined it, locked it away, and that was that." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes remained sharp. "I understand, Mr. Golding," she said. "Desperation can cloud even the best intentions. But let's think back to the auction. You were near the case just before the bidding, adjusting the light, I believe. Did you open it then, perhaps to check the stone one last time?" Golding shook his head vehemently. "No, I didn't open it. I only adjusted the lamp to show the diamond's facets. The lock was secure, the key with Mr. Hurst, I swear. I didn't touch it after my initial inspection." His voice cracked, and he clutched his spectacles as if they were a lifeline. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over his words. She thought of Mr. Simmons, the St. Mary Mead tailor, who had once hidden his gambling debts behind a facade of respectability, his nervous tics betraying him when he questioned. Golding's agitation was similar, and the waxy smudge on his satchel, coupled with the scratch on the lock, suggested more than he was admitting. Yet his denials were fierce, and she sensed a kernel of truth in his fear. "One last thing, Mr. Golding," she said, her tone as gentle as ever. "Did you speak with Mr. Hurst or Mrs. Henshaw during the evening?" They both seemed quite interested in the pendant's fate. Golding hesitated, his fingers drumming on his knee. "Mr. Hurst asked me to confirm the pendant's details before he announced it," he said. "He was all business as usual." "Mrs. Henshaw. She spoke to me briefly, complimenting my work. She's always gracious, but I was too busy to chat." His eyes flicked to his satchel, and he reached for it, pulling it back to his lap. "Thank you, Mr. Golding," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "You've given me much to think about. I shan't keep you further." As Golding rose, his movements stiff and hurried, he muttered a farewell and slipped out, his satchel clutched tightly. Miss Marple leaned back, her needles still for a moment as she pondered the encounter. Golding's panic was genuine, but so was his access to the case. The scratch on the lock, the waxy speck on the velvet, and the smudge on his satchel formed a troubling pattern. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a jeweller's apprentice had crafted a paste gem to replace a stolen brooch, his guilt revealed by a smudged mould hidden in his toolkit. "Desperation," she murmured, "makes thieves of honest men." She tucked her knitting into her bag, resolved to examine the case again, and to speak with Mrs. Henshaw about that handkerchief. Golding's secrets were close to the surface, but the truth of the theft required one more thread to tie the knot. The jewel is still here, she thought, hidden by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Chapter 10. The Handkerchief's Clue. The soft light of late morning filtered through the lace curtains of Larchmont Hall's morning room, where Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting, the needles moving in their steady, meditative rhythm. The room was a delicate contrast to the grandeur of the ballroom. Its pale walls adorned with watercolours of pastoral scenes, and a faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Miss Marple had requested another conversation with Mrs. Clara Henshaw, prompted by the tantalizing clue of the monogrammed handkerchief found near the display case. The widow's charm and composure had intrigued her from the start, and this small detail, perhaps trivial, perhaps pivotal, demanded further exploration. Mrs. Henshaw entered with her usual grace, her silver hair gleaming under a chic hat adorned with a single peacock feather. Her dress, a soft shade of mauve, rustled faintly as she settled into the chair opposite Miss Marple, her ivory fan resting in her lap like an extension of her elegance. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice warm and melodic, "how delightful to see you again. I trust you're making progress with this unfortunate business of the pendant." Miss Marple's smile was as gentle as the morning light. "Slowly but surely, Mrs. Henshaw," she replied, her needles clicking softly. "It's the little things, you know, that often lead to the truth. I was hoping you might help me with one such detail. A handkerchief, monogrammed with CH, found near the display case after the theft. I believe it may be yours." Mrs. Henshaw's fan paused mid-flutter, and her smile tightened, though her composure held like a well-stitched seam. "My handkerchief," she said, her tone light but tinged with surprise. "Oh, I suppose it could be. I do have several with my initials. Such a common thing to carry. I must have dropped it while admiring the pendant earlier in the evening. How careless of me." She laughed, a silvery sound that seemed to dance in the air. But Miss Marple noted the faint strain in her eyes. "Easily done," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "I've dropped many a handkerchief myself at village fêtes." "But it's curious, isn't it, that it was found so close to the case? You were there before the auction, I recall, admiring the Star of Avalon. Did you notice anything unusual at the time?" Mrs. Henshaw's fan resumed its gentle motion, a shield against scrutiny. "Nothing at all," she said. "The diamond was dazzling, of course, and the case was locked. I saw Mr. Golding secure it myself." I lingered for a moment, but then I returned to my seat. "The room was so crowded, Miss Marple, it's hard to say what might have happened after that." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the careful cadence, as if each syllable had been rehearsed. "How true," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing as she reached for her tea. "Crowds do complicate things, and you were seated near the back, weren't you? Yet you spoke with Mr. Hurst later by the terrace doors. A servant mentioned you seemed quite friendly." Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp behind her spectacles, watching for any flicker of unease. Mrs. Henshaw's smile wavered, but she recovered swiftly, her fan moving with a touch more vigour. "Mr. Hurst is always charming," she said. "We exchanged a few words about the auction success. He's so passionate about his work, you know. I find it refreshing, especially in such a formal setting." She tilted her head, her expression one of polite amusement, as if dismissing the implication of anything more. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "He does have a flair," she agreed. "And Mr. Golding? You mentioned complimenting his work. He seemed rather anxious, didn't he? Handling such a valuable jewel." "Oh, poor Mr. Golding," Mrs. Henshaw said, her voice softening with what might have been pity. "He was terribly nervous, fussing with his satchel and muttering to himself. I suppose the pressure of authenticating such a piece would weigh on anyone. I only spoke to him briefly, to put him at ease. He's not accustomed to such grand events, I think." Her fan slowed, and she leaned forward slightly, as if confiding. "Between us, Miss Marple, I suspect he's in some financial trouble. He mentioned his shop struggling, though he tried to make light of it." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with interest. "How kind of you to notice," she said. "Financial troubles can be such a burden. I understand your late husband faced similar challenges, didn't he? It must be difficult, maintaining such elegance in trying times." Mrs. Henshaw's fan stilled, and for a moment her composure faltered, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Harold's affairs were complicated," she said, her voice measured. "He left me comfortable enough, but I've had to be prudent. These auctions are a diversion, Miss Marple, not a necessity. I have no need for stolen jewels." Her smile returned, but it was cooler now, like a breeze carrying the first hint of winter. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as ever. "I only mention it because you were so near the case, and that handkerchief is such a curious detail. It was clean, you see. No wax, no smudges, just your initials. It made me wonder if it was placed there deliberately, perhaps to distract attention." Mrs. Henshaw's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. "Placed deliberately," she said. "My dear Miss Marple, you do have a vivid imagination." I assure you it was simply an accident. I'm no thief, nor am I so careless as to leave clues pointing to myself." She rose, smoothing her dress with a practised hand. "I hope you find the pendant soon. It's such a pity to see Lady Beatrice so distressed." Miss Marple stood as well, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Henshaw," she said. "I shan't keep you further. Enjoy the rest of your morning." As Mrs. Henshaw glided out, her mauve dress catching the light like a fading petal, Miss Marple sat back, her mind sifting through the conversation. The widow's charm was a polished shield, deflecting questions with ease, but that moment of unease over the handkerchief had been telling. Her financial straits, confirmed by her own admission, suggested a motive, and her presence near the case offered opportunity. Yet the handkerchief's cleanliness puzzled her. Unlike Golding's waxy smudge, it bore no trace of tampering. "A distraction," she murmured, "but not the key." She thought of Miss Pollitt, the dressmaker in St. Mary Mead, whose charming exterior hid a penchant for borrowing trinkets from her clients, always with a plausible excuse. Mrs. Henshaw's poise was similar, but her denial was too firm, her story too neat. The mention of Golding's anxiety and Hurst's charm added new threads to the azure tapestry. But the handkerchief remained a loose end, tugging at her thoughts. Miss Marple resolved to revisit the timing of the auction, particularly Golding's brief absence to adjust the case's light. She also wanted to confirm Hurst's movements after the bidding, given his friendly exchange with Mrs. Henshaw. The clues, scratch on the lock, waxy speck, smudged glass, and now the handkerchief, were forming a pattern, but the final piece eluded her. "Someone saw their chance," she thought, "and they took it with precision." She gathered her things, determined to press forward. Her next step, a closer look at the auction's critical moments. Chapter 11. The final piece. The grand ballroom of Larchmont Hall, so recently a stage for opulence and intrigue, was now a theatre for resolution. The chandeliers, though unlit, cast a faint gleam from the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the polished oak floor and the empty display case at the room's heart. Miss Jane Marple had requested that the key figures, Mr. Percival Hurst, Mr. Roland Finch, Mr. Ezra Golding, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw, gather here, along with Lady Beatrice Worthington and Constable Reed. Her slight figure stood near the case, her knitting bag at her feet, her demeanour as unassuming as ever. Yet her mild blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, held a quiet authority that commanded the room's attention. The suspects stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions a mix of curiosity, unease, and defiance. Hurst's moustache twitched with impatience, his gold cufflinks catching the light. Finch's broad shoulders were tense, his face flushed with lingering indignation. Golding clutched his satchel, his spectacles slipping down his nose, while Mrs. Henshaw's fan moved slowly, her smile serene but guarded. Lady Beatrice, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief, looked to Miss Marple with desperate hope. Constable Reed stood by the door, notebook in hand, his earnest face betraying a touch of awe at the elderly spinster's presence. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, carrying the clarity of a village church bell. "The disappearance of the Star of Avalon has caused great distress, and I believe we can resolve it here, today, by piecing together the truth. It's the small things, you see, that tell the story." Hurst cleared his throat, his tone edged with irritation. Miss Marple, I've told you, I was at my podium the entire time. I saw nothing untoward. This is a waste of time." Miss Marple's smile was placid. "Patience, Mr. Hurst," she said. "Let us begin with the facts. The pendant was in its locked case, authenticated by Mr. Golding, displayed under the watchful eyes of 100 guests. Yet it vanished without a trace. A locked case, a crowded room, quite a puzzle, don't you think?" Finch snorted, crossing his arms. "A puzzle? It's theft, plain and simple. Someone here took it, and I want my £12,000 worth." Mrs. Henshaw's fan fluttered, and she tilted her head. "Really, Mr. Finch, such accusations. I'm sure Miss Marple has a theory, don't you?" Her voice was smooth, but her eyes flickered with unease. Miss Marple's needles resting in her lap gleamed faintly. "A theory, yes," she said, "but first, let us consider the clues." A scratch on the lock, so faint it might be overlooked. A waxy speck on the velvet cushion. A smudge on the glass high up, suggesting a tall person or a chair. And a handkerchief, monogrammed CH, found nearby. She paused, her gaze sweeping the group. Each points to a moment, a movement, a motive. Golding's face paled, and he clutched his satchel tighter. I told you, Miss Marple, I locked the case. The scratch wasn't my doing. My tools are for jewels, not locks." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but unwavering. "Indeed, Mr. Golding. But let us revisit your role. You authenticated the pendant, locked it in the case, and adjusted the light just before the bidding. You had access, and, forgive me, your financial troubles are no secret. A jewel like the star could erase many debts, could it not?" Golding's spectacles slipped, and he pushed them up with a trembling hand. "I didn't steal it," he cried. "I'm a jeweller, not a thief. I swear the pendant was real when I locked it away." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "I believe you, Mr. Golding, when you say the pendant was real then. But consider this. A jeweller's skill is not only in appraising stones, but in crafting them. A replica, made with care, could fool even the sharpest eye, especially in a locked case under bright lights. The waxy speck, the smudge on your satchel, might they suggest a mould created to fashion a counterfeit stone?" The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Golding's face crumpled, and he sank into a chair, his satchel falling to the floor. "No," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple turned to the others. "Mr. Hurst, your vigilance at the podium was admirable, but your cufflinks, such fine gold, suggest expenses beyond an auctioneer's means. And Mrs. Henshaw, your handkerchief was a curious find, though its cleanliness suggests it was not part of the theft itself. Mr. Finch, your ambition drove your bid, but your torn coat hints at a struggle, perhaps a moment of haste." Hurst bristled. Finch scowled, and Mrs. Henshaw's fan stilled. But Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. "The truth lies in the timing. Mr. Golding, you were alone with the case before the auction, during your inspection. You had the key, the tools, and the skill. I believe you crafted a replica, swapped it for the real pendant, and hid the star in your satchel, intending to sell it abroad. The scratch on the lock, the wax on the cushion, these were traces of your men." Golding's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "No! I couldn't," but his words faltered, and he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Constable Reed stepped forward, his notebook forgotten. "Is that a confession, sir?" he asked, his voice firm. Miss Marple nodded gently. "I think, Constable, if you examine Mr. Golding's satchel, you'll find the Star of Avalon." The replica was convincing, but it was never meant to be scrutinized after the auction. Mr. Golding planned to be long gone before the truth came out. Reed moved swiftly, retrieving the satchel from the floor. Golding made no move to stop him, his face ashen. The constable opened it, revealing a small velvet pouch tucked among the tools. He drew out the pendant, its diamond catching the light in a dazzling blaze. Lady Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's the star!" she cried. Golding's voice was barely a whisper. "I had no choice," he said. "The debts, they were crushing me. I thought I could replace it, sell the real one, and no one would know. I'm sorry." His head bowed, and Reed placed a hand on his shoulder, signalling for a constable outside to assist. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. "Desperation," she said quietly, "can lead even good men astray. But the truth, Mr. Golding, always finds its way." As Reed led Golding away, the room exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. Lady Beatrice rushed to Miss Marple, her eyes shining with gratitude. "How did you know?" she asked. "It seemed impossible." Miss Marple smiled, tucking her knitting away. "People are much the same, Lady Beatrice, whether in a grand hall or a village shop. They leave traces of wax, of ambition, of charm. One only needs to look Chapter 12, Reflections by the Fire." The evening had settled over Larchmont Hall with a quiet grace, the turmoil of the stolen Star of Avalon now resolved, leaving a sense of calm in its wake. In the drawing-room, where a fire crackled merrily in the grate, Miss Jane Marple sat in a comfortable armchair, her knitting bag at her side. The flames cast a warm glow across her slight figure, her needles moving with their familiar soothing rhythm, each stitch a testament to the order she had restored. The room was intimate, its heavy drapes drawn against the night, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and polished mahogany. Lady Beatrice Worthington, her composure regained, sat opposite, her eyes still bright with gratitude. "Oh, Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice warm with relief, "I cannot thank you enough. To think the pendant was in Mr. Golding's satchel all along. You've saved the hospital fund and my reputation. How ever did you see through it all?" Miss Marple's smile was as gentle as the firelight. "It's only a matter of observation, Lady Beatrice," she said, her needles clicking softly. "People are much like my neighbours in St. Mary Mead, full of small tells that betray their intentions. A scratch on a lock, a speck of wax, a nervous glance. These things speak louder than words." Lady Beatrice leaned forward, her lace shawl slipping slightly. "But Mr. Golding seemed so respectable," she said. I never would have suspected him. And that replica, such a cunning trick." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes crinkling with a hint of amusement. "Desperation can make a craftsman of any man," she said. "Mr. Golding's debts pressed him hard, and his skill as a jeweller gave him the means. I thought of Mr. Hargreaves, our clockmaker in the village, who once tried to pass off a repaired clock as new to settle a debt. The signs were similar, a waxy smudge, a hurried manner. Mr. Golding's satchel held the truth, as I suspected." She paused, her needles stilling for a moment as she sipped her tea, set thoughtfully on a side table by a attentive maid. "Mr. Hurst's theatrics, Mr. Finch's ambition, Mrs. Henshaw's charm. They all played their parts, you know. Each drew my eye, but it was Mr. Golding's access to the case and his nervous tics that pointed the way. The handkerchief, I confess, was a distraction. Mrs. Henshaw's carelessness, not her guilt. Lady Beatrice shook her head, marvelling. And to think I invited them all, trusting their reputations. You must have a gift, Miss Marple, to see through such facades. No gift, my dear, Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. Only experience. In a village, one learns to notice the little things. The way a man fidgets when he's hiding a debt, or a woman smiles to mask her fears. Mr. Hurst's cufflinks were too grand, Mr. Finch's coat too torn, Mrs. Henshaw's poise too perfect. But Mr. Golding's hands trembled, and his satchel told a story of wax and secrets. She leaned back, her eyes drifting to the fire, where the logs snapped and sparked. It's much like knitting, you see, she continued. Each stitch must be precise, or the pattern unravels. The clues were the stitches, the scratch, the smudge, the wax, and they formed a pattern only when I saw them together. Lady Beatrice smiled, her tension easing. You make it sound so simple, she said. The hospital fund is safe, and the pendant will be auctioned again, properly this time. I shall insist on better locks. But tell me, Miss Marple, will you stay a few days? We'd be so honoured. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked at her hostess with a kindly gaze. You're very kind, Lady Beatrice, she said, but I think I'll return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow. My garden needs tending, and I suspect another puzzle will find me soon enough. They always do. As Lady Beatrice rose to bid her good night, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her thoughts drifting to her village. She thought of Mrs. Price, whose gossip had once revealed a theft at the church bazaar, and young Tommy Pierce, whose torn jacket had betrayed a childish prank. People, she reflected, were the same everywhere, driven by want, fear, or pride, their secrets woven into the fabric of their actions. The Star of Avalon had been recovered, but the human heart, with its endless complexities, was the true mystery. Her needles clicked once more, a steady rhythm against the fire's crackle. The truth lies in the details, she murmured, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. She tucked her knitting into her bag, certain that another mystery, small or grand, would soon call her to unravel its threads.